Hello and welcome to Genius Medical Education. Today we will be focusing on a topic that is important for didactics, specifically neurology and anatomy, neurology rotations and shelves, internal medicine rotations and shelves, step 1, step 2, and step 3, and definitely your ICU electives, and truly the rest of your career. No matter what field you go into, this is something you will definitely need to know. And that is neurology localization. And depending on what you do go into for your future career, the level to which and the detail to which you use neurology localization might vary. However, for our training, we definitely need to be strong in our basics and able to build on to those basics. And for that reason, I am going to leave timestamps below, depending on what level of learning you're at, if you're past the basics and the backbones of neurology localization and onto more specific or more complicated levels of neurology localization. So feel free to jump around. The true backbone of neurology localization is the 12 cranial nerves. This is our North Star, and anytime we're faced with any question or any patient where we feel we need to have some localization, we will always come back to the 12 cranial nerves. Now, when taking an exam or doing practice questions, I always recommend starting by listing the 12 cranial nerves, 1 through 12, listing them in a row on your piece of paper. Now, it is important that we list our cranial nerves in the right order, so we have a useful mnemonic to help us remember the proper order of our cranial nerves. And I find it most helpful to jog my memory by writing down the first letter of this mnemonic next to the number of the cranial nerve, which we have here. So OOOTTAFVGVAH. And now, of course, we know that mnemonics are supposed to be helpful, and having these letters listed in a row is not exactly the most memorable things. So what do these letters stand for? So on this channel, this stands for 100, took the anatomy final, very good vibes are happening. We're talking about neuroanatomy here. Of course, we're going to get 100 on our anatomy final. And using the first letter in this mnemonic for every word, cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, 2 is the optic nerve, 3 is oculomotor nerve, 4 is trochlear, 5 is trigeminal, 6 is abducens, 7 is facial, 8 is vestibulocochlear, 9 is glossopharyngeal, 10 is vagus, 11 is axillary, and 12 is hypoglossal. And while I do often find myself going back to that mnemonic, 100, took the anatomy final, very good vibes are happening, to list out the cranial nerves, what I'm going to tell you now is helpful in the beginning for connecting which letter to which cranial nerve, but I promise you that you will not have to use this for long. These will stick with you when you're going to associate a certain number with a certain cranial nerve. But for now, I hope that these tricks help. So the first part of a mnemonic is 100, and so that OO, which is the optic and the oculomotor nerves, kind of look like eyes, right? OO, the two eyes like I've shown here. And so we can remember that 2 and 3 are the nerves relating to the eyes. So the first is the olfactory nerve, which is related to the sense of smell. And the next is our optic and our oculomotor nerve. We then see that there are 2 T's in a row, and the trick we have for this is to use the letters in our mnemonic. So our letters and our words are took thee. And you'll see that both nerves start with the letters TR. So those they have in common. So we're going to go to the next letter to determine what nerve is either 4 or 5. And so the third letter in trochlear is O. And the word associated with trochlear in the mnemonic is took, so T-O. So we're going to use that to remember that trochlear comes before trigeminal. Next, we can see that 2 of our nerves begin with the letter A. our abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve 6, and our axillary nerve, which is cranial nerve 11. The way in which we're going to remember these is that axillary has the letters X and Y in them, which are way towards the end of the alphabet and very easy to remember. And those are letters that really stick out in that word. So we know that axillary is the second A cranial nerve. And finally, we have 2 V cranial nerves. 8 is vestibulocochlear and 10 is our vagus nerve. Now, honestly, like I said, I don't think you're going to need these tricks for long. The vagus nerve is such an important nerve that we usually very easily associate it with cranial nerve 10. But in the meantime, while getting more comfortable with these nerves, the way to remember this is that 100 took the anatomy final very. So very is the word for cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear, and the second letter in vestibulocochlear is E. So they share that in common because when we get down to 10, the letter is vibes, does not start with an E. So that's how we can remember that one for now. Once I have my cranial nerves down, the next thing I like to do is focus on if this is a sensory, motor, or mixed nerve. So we're going to use the following mnemonic to do so. So this mnemonic is, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. And in this case, S stands for sensory, M stands for motor, and B stands for both sensory and motor. This is a little bit lower yield, but I do like to include this for completion's sake. And, if you're taking an anatomy final or anatomy exam, this honestly is not lower yield. This is pretty heavily tested. So I typically like to write my cranial nerve in the middle. On the one side, I like to have, usually on the right, I like to have my sensory motor mnemonic. And then on the left side of my cranial nerves, I like to include the location at which the cranial nerve is exiting the skull, which is the mnemonic we have here. This one's slightly more complicated in that the trigeminal nerve has 3 branches, and we do have to write out all 3 when using this mnemonic. So this mnemonic is, can Obama spray super soakers right on senators? Is it juvenile? Just joking, Hillary. And so we're using the cranial nerves, splitting up trigeminal into 3 to denote the location at which the cranial nerves exit the skull, with C standing for cribriform plate, O optic canal, S superior orbital fissure, R foramen rotundum, O foramen ovale, I internal acoustic meatus, J jugular foramen, and H hypoglossal canal. All right, now we can return back to our 12 cranial nerves, and when writing them in order, we can split them up into what area of the brain or brainstem we can actually find these nerves. So the first 2 are not found within the brainstem. So we start with 3 and 4, oculomotor and trochlear, and those are found within the midbrain. The next 4, trigeminal, abducens, facial, and vestibulocochlear, are found within the pons. And the next 4, glossopharyngeal, vagus, axillary, and hypoglossal, are found within the medulla. So we have a 2-4-4 rule. And this is going to be very helpful for us later on when we're discussing brainstem strokes. A different way to learn this is the rule of 4s with the pons. So there are 4 cranial nerves above the pons, there are 4 cranial nerves below the pons, and there are 4 cranial nerves within the pons. Just please remember that there's only 2 nerves above the pons that are found within the midbrain. All 4 nerves below the pons are found within the medulla. Our final level of localization that we will learn in this video is where the cranial nerves lie within the brain, whether they are midline or they are peripheral. This is once again very important for when we're talking about strokes. So we're going to go back to our sensory motor both mnemonic to help us with this. Every single cranial nerve that I've underlined in orange is a midline cranial nerve. Every other cranial nerve is lateral, keeping in mind that we only use the midline or lateral classification for brainstem cranial nerves. So we are not talking about cranial nerves 1 and cranial nerve 2 when we are talking about midline and lateral. You may notice that every single cranial nerve that is underlined as a midline structure is a motor nerve. M for midline or M for motor. This is helpful, but we can't just rely on the cranial nerve being motor to determine if this is a midline structure. Instead, what we use is kind of another rule of four, slightly different. We talk about numbers that divide evenly into 12. Those are our midline structures. They are all motor cranial nerves, but they all divide evenly into 12. Of course, not including cranial nerves 1 and 2, because those are not brainstem cranial nerves. So our midline cranial nerves are 3, 4, 6, and 12. That leaves 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 as lateral cranial nerves. That is going to sum up our neurology localization for this video. But after this video, we now know all the cranial nerves in order. We know whether they are sensory, motor, or both. We know the area of the skull in which the cranial nerves exit the brain. We know if they are brainstem cranial nerves, and specifically midbrain, pons, or medulla. And we know if our cranial nerves are midline or lateral. I recommend whenever you are approached with a neuroanatomy question to write this out on your practice paper and have it as a visual guide for you to approach every single neuroanatomy question. Now, to finish this video off, why don't we do a practice question to ensure we understand everything we just learned? A patient experiences damage that results in loss of most eye motor function. Damage to which area of the brain could have resulted in this dysfunction? Is it A, midline midbrain, B, lateral midbrain, C, midline pons, D, lateral pons, E, midline medulla, or F, lateral medulla? Pause the video here if you would like to figure out the answer on your own. At this point, I would probably draw out this entire schematic that we've covered here. I know that we're talking about a cranial nerve that is involved in most of the motor functions of the eye, which is cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve, like the name suggests, is a motor nerve. I know that it is found within the midbrain because it is cranial nerve number 3, and we know 3 and 4 are found within the midbrain. And I know that this is one of my midline or medial nerves because it is divisible into 12. 12 divided by 3 is 4, which is an even number. So I know that this is a midline, midbrain damage that could have occurred that would cause dysfunction of oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. Now, the damage doesn't necessarily need to be occurring in the midline, midbrain. However, based off of the way that the question was asked, none of those other locations could cause damage to cranial nerve 3. There are other ways in which these questions could be asked, but when they're asked in this way, what we really need to do is go back to where do we find these cranial nerves within the brainstem, and we can answer the question. I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear from you if you have any other tips for neurology localization. And please like, comment, and subscribe to Gene-ius for more med ed resources. And please look out for Neurolocalization Part 2 coming out soon.